Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back. Another podcast style video, and this time we're going to be talking about buying a second-hand drift car. As you guys may know, all these videos are not scripted at all. It's just me switching on the camera when I'm on my way to somewhere. So obviously, everybody who's been building drift cars knows that it's really expensive. Especially if you're not really experienced in it, it's very easy to make financial mistakes, as it's called. There's actually very few people that make any calculations before they start building a car, especially in my country, in the Netherlands. People really don't think things through, especially if they don't know what they're talking about, which is really weird to me because I don't know anything about building houses. So if I would build a house, I would definitely have some question marks and ask somebody to price things out or to do project management or whatever. Because especially if you don't know anything about anything and it's potentially expensive, then obviously it doesn't make much sense to do stuff by yourself. But people in racing and drifting are always very headstrong. And I always say a lot of people decide their build process because their neighbor gives them an old turbo of his truck and they're like, hey, I have a free turbo, let's build a drift car. And I use that joke a lot, and because I actually know one person that actually did it that way, wasn't into drifting, wasn't into cars at all, and then his neighbor gave him some turbo, leftover turbo, and then they're like, oh yeah, what car should I put this on? Oh, maybe we should go drifting with it. And that's like, of course, it's romantic and funny and cool and whatever, but it's my business. So it's my business building race cars, drift cars, and selling parts for drift cars and race cars. So we can't really have that funny, romantic lifestyle about it, because clients, they really wouldn't appreciate it if we did it that way. So everything that I'm discussing, everything that I'm advising, is always going to be from a professional standpoint. I think I've also haven't emphasized that enough in my older videos, because sometimes people say like, yeah, but it's like the lifestyle and it's this and that and it's so important and cool. You know, if something breaks, everybody fixes it for you. And I get that, and I like that, and I like that lifestyle, and I appreciate it. And I have lots and lots of friends over here and in America that have that lifestyle, that are like running stuff on running a second-hand engine for 6 years in a row unopened, putting really expensive wheels on that car, and do basically the opposite of what I always do, which is building from the inside out. So putting your money first in the locations where you can't really improve it afterwards easily. So the internals of the motor, the roll cage, the fab work, which is stuff that you're all not going to revisit. So I always say build from the inside out, and a lot of people build from the outside in. So they're like, what body kit, what wheels, and they're like, oh damn, we had a 10 grand budget and I've spent 5 grand on wheels and 3 grand on my body kit and a little bit on the paint, and now you know, I have to run some second-hand transmission with a broken synchro and all kinds of wrong ratio differentials and leaky steering racks and all that stuff. So that's like two different ways, and I like that. I think it's cool if I see a guy that's like running on a super tight budget with a really cool looking car. I sometimes even envy them, because I'm not like that. Like my cars, before I spend money on like expensive wheels and stuff, the rest is all going to be built to a very high level. So financially, that's going to be a really expensive car if you do both. If you do both the expensive styling and expensive wheels and all the internals of the motor forged and new and everything done correctly and lots of fab work. And that's just, you know, that's the way to make an expensive car. My cars are more like the money goes into the actual mechanic bits, and it goes a little bit less into a body kit or the wheels or whatever. Although my pro cars, of course, have HDK Kevlar body kit and no rep wheels and all that stuff. But that's a pro car. It's a little bit different. So I hope everybody understands. I'm looking at it from a standpoint of maximum seat time, because it's also really funny to me that a lot of the more style guys, they will talk shit about a pro car build, like, no, you just need seat time, seat time, seat time. And they'll say like, I don't never want an LS, I hate V8s, V8 and all that stuff. If you want seat time, drop an LS1 with a T56 in an S13 or an E36, E46, and you can do 90% of all the events in Europe and in America. Simple as that. Like, you can build that car for less than 20 grand. So if you talk about seat time, that's seat time for you right there. Aaron's V8 cars are his most reliable cars. Lone Star Drift Aaron. He's of course a big JDM guy, a big Abisu guy, but he's also a realist, and he's pretty smart. So he's like, yeah, there's no denying that the simple V8 cars. I think his red car is actually even an iron block with the Tremec on it. Like, that's like very, very reliable car. So if you want to emphasize on seat time, maybe don't emphasize on 3-piece wheels and really expensive body kits, but just, you know, get the mechanicals done. So that's always like kind of like a mystery to me. That seems that the guys that talk shit about pro cars and are all about seat time, that they run like unopened SR20s with 500 horsepower. But okay, whatever, doesn't matter. So the thing, what we're talking about here is, of course, buying a second-hand drift car. And like I said, everybody who's built a drift car knows that it's really expensive, and it's not just like the clutch and the transmission, because that's what everybody knows, but it's all the small stuff. So we've built tons and tons of cars, and if you've built a lot of cars, it becomes really clear that it's all the nickel and dime stuff. So if we're making a budget, I sometimes put a little subject in there with like unknown costs, which can be like 3,000-4,000 euros on a pro car build. People are like, yeah, what's that unknown cost? Like, why don't you know that? Like, you've built E46 before. I'm like, yeah, but like, that's exactly why, you know, because there's going to be stuff, even cars that we built, like many of them, exact same car with the exact same parts, you're always going to run into things. So, and it's all the small stuff, especially like wiring and stuff. That's definitely one of those things that you do last, and people are then already hugely over budget. So like smart people who budget for a car, they'll have budget for the cage, because that's the first thing you do. They'll have budget for the motor, because that's what everybody talks about. Motor. It's like super important to everybody, although I just see a motor as a unit, like a seat or like a steering wheel. It's just a unit that needs to do what it has to do, and it would be cool to have a really stylish seat or a really stylish steering wheel, but the function of the seat is to fit me well and to keep me safe, and the function of the steering wheel is exactly the same. So that's like the first thing, and a lot of people are they really emphasize on the big things budget-wise, and they totally forget that the car needs wiring. Like, yeah, but my buddy is really smart and he's wired an RFE, so he can do that. And I think we have between 3,000 and 4,000 euros worth of tools just for wiring, and we don't even do the weird extreme mil-spec stuff, because I have one of those mil-spec pliers, which is like 600 euros or something, and there's guys that have the guys that do real motorsport wiring, like super thin stuff. So I like to keep the wiring not like super thick, but a little bit thicker, like 2-3 mil wiring. Why? Because it's only going to be maybe 10 pounds heavier on the whole harness, but it isolates better against heat, better against vibration if something happens, if you crash or something. So the super thin wires that are used in actual race cars, that's great for cars that get rebuilt a lot. Yeah, it's just not great. Like, drifting is a contact sport, so I like wiring harnesses to be a little bit more beefy. Also, you need to keep in mind that you're putting stuff in different locations than where it used to be. So people will, if you have a really short wire between the starter and the battery from the factory, and you start moving the battery to the back, you need to change the size of the wiring, because the length of the wiring is going to give it more resistance, so it needs to be thicker. So it has the same resistance going to the battery. So that's one of those things. Keep that in mind. Wiring, a lot of drift cars, just be safe. Take the wires a little bit thicker. Also, all the tools for a little bit thicker wire. So I'm not talking super thick. Like, I'm not talking about agricultural thick, but like what a little bit thicker. Like, let's say 10-20% thicker than what would be in a road car. Because the tools to do that are a little bit cheaper. The connectors for that are a little bit cheaper. The wiring is expensive no matter what, doesn't matter which size you take. Wiring is crazy expensive these days because of the copper pricing. But there's like the stuff like I factor in $1,000 or $1,500 just in materials for the wiring, just materials, and then we're not doing PDMs or whatever. We're going to be doing PDMs in the new FD Corvette, probably in my Corvette as well, and it's going to be the first time that we're going to be 100% relying on that, because I have seen some failures with PDMs, and as you guys all know, I like simple things. I like things you can work on, things that you can influence, and if a PDM doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's done. So like I said on the FD, when we had the meetings about building the FD car, I said like, okay, we can run a PDM, because I'm not like stubborn. Like if somebody has really good arguments and if it works, it's perfect. But I was like, yeah, if we're going to run a PDM, we really need to have a spare PDM with us at all times. And still, like as some of you may know, the spare thing, it's a good idea, but sometimes you don't have time. So if there's something wrong with the car, like, hey, we don't know why the fans aren't coming on, and it's like 5 minutes before the start, like there's no way you're swapping out a PDM for that. So wiring, I keep it simple. I like to run actual physical relays. You can actually get solid state normal relays. The normal relays that you stick in a holder, you can get them in solid state as well from Bosch, so that's what we use a lot. But the wiring is, like I said, if you do it correct with all the correct connectors, with bulkhead connectors, it's going to be $1,000 to $1,500 just the stuff, and then you still need to do it, of course. So that's one of those things. All that nickel and dime stuff is going to make it really expensive if you're building a completely new car. I think on the Supra build we're over $5,000 in small stuff, so it's all like small, like make a little piece for this, make a little shield for that, and like little banjos, adapters for the steering rack to turn it into AN, all kinds of small stuff. Like usually if you run a V8 in a car, you need to do something with the original steering column in the engine bay because it's too beefy or whatever, so you need to run chromoly couplers, which we sell a lot. All that stuff, like a good chromoly coupler or joint for in the steering assembly is $250, and there's people like, oh, I found the same one for $80. Take it, please take it, because it's just your steering. What could go wrong? What could go wrong if you flick a car with 1,000 horsepower really close to a wall with 100 mile an hour? Like, I would really love some untested chromoly Chinese joint. Like, what's the worst that could happen, you know? So anyways, so all that small stuff, like I'm building my E36 now, the new E36, and that's like I'm kind of like harvesting parts for the car, which I have been for years. So that car is going to have a lot of weird Alpina parts and weird M parts on it and stuff that I've gathered through the years. And now I'm gathering like all the stuff like the steering column, all those things. S14 is the same thing that we're building, and it's pretty big bills. Like every week, the bills that I pay to get the parts, it's pretty hefty, you know. And it's just the beginning of the build. It's just all the fab stuff for the exhaust, V bands, yeah, like safety stuff, like seat belts, all the little things, Lexan windows and stuff. So all that stuff's going to make it really expensive, and that's why we're finally, like after 15 minutes, reaching the topic of this video, which is a secondhand drift car. So it makes it really interesting to buy a secondhand drift car, of course, because people, for some reason, always really, like I've had clients that spend like 60, 70 grand on a car, and they're like, oh, I'm having a baby on the way, and so that, what can we do? And I'm like, yeah, you know, I can offer it for sale to people, but it's never going to be sold for what you paid us to build it, of course. Some cars is different. Like there's some cars that are even sold for more than we charge a client to build them. If you do a car to a super high standard, like FD or DMAC, or really nice fab work and like done really well, so with no rivets or screws or all kinds of weird shit, just everything nice, metric nuts and bolts and everything, and like a good wiring harness and everything, then those cars can sell really quickly, because it's usually a professional that has a big pile of cash from a sponsor or something that's like, hey, we need a car, and those guys will only buy top end cars. So I'm always saying to people, if you're building like a 50 grand car, which is very difficult because a pro car is between 80 and 200 grand, and a Drift Week or Pro or like grassroots car is between 10 and 30 grand. So let's say that you're in this 50 grand thing. I'm always saying like, hey, you're a little bit, you're not really running a built motor, running everything a little bit cheaper shocks, a little bit cheaper transmission and clutch and all the stuff. It's a little bit better if you just spend that extra 10 or 12 grand so to turn it into a real professional car. So get rid of that BMW diesel transmission, get a really good transmission in it, get rid of that standard differential, put a quick change in it, because if you have a car for sale with a good build motor, with a V8 or a 2J, and it's a good compatible chassis, like an S chassis or an E46 or an E90, and it has a quick change in the transmission and it's all working, and you have a good dyno run with, that's the kind of cars that professionals will buy, and they will pay good money for that. If you are, so that would be a car that's like, let's say an absolute minimum would be like 75 grand to build if done correctly. So it's medium build quality, like medium quality paint, medium quality fab work, but like good components like transmission and gearbox and stuff like that. So that will be a car that a professional wants to buy, because professionals are really seasoned in all that stuff. So they don't want to run an old diff, they don't want to run an old transmission. They just know that those are the pitfalls. Those cars are kind of valuable, but everything else that's like an almost car, so to speak, that's a little bit more difficult to sell, because people know that they have to put some money in it to make it like really good, and then it becomes a whole different scope. So if somebody buys something that's completely done already, that's 100% finished, they don't mind paying a little bit more for it. But if the car, so let's say if a car is 60 grand, but it needs 10 grand in work, for instance with a quick change and proper axles and stuff, then people will offer like 30 or 40. But if it's 100% ready to go, people will pay 60 or 70. So yeah, there's of course a little bit of a gap there, and it's like I said, like if you need to spend another 10 grand to get your car to absolute pro level, it's definitely gonna sell easier, and it's definitely gonna bring more money, because it's a different kind of buyer. Like there's some race car drivers that we work with, and they're just drivers. In racing, of course, the drivers usually aren't fabricators or car builders, and they will pay full price for a race car that's the right car, that doesn't need any work, and they'll pay like I said, they'll pay 40 grand more than they would pay for a car that needs 10 grand of work. So people say like, yeah, so the other car needs 10 grand of work, so it's worth 10 grand less. But that's not true. Like a car that needs 10 grand of work, for most people that are in a position to buy a 50, 60 grand car, is not going to bring 10 grand less than a car that doesn't need 10 grand of work. Like it's a little bit difficult to understand, but it's like a pyramid. Like the amount of people that can pay that money, they're usually pretty busy. They usually aren't shop owners. They're like professional drivers, and they're like, oh, we have this deal with Monster Energy or whatever, and we want to run a car in South Africa for this and that event. So they're not going to buy a car and send it somewhere and can't get parts and all this stuff. They'll just buy something that's 100% done. So I always encourage people, if you're 80, 90% there, go the extra distance and build that car completely, because one, you're going to have a better car yourself when you're using it, and when the time comes to sell, it's way easier to sell, because it's going to bring full price, because it needs nothing, or it doesn't need any changing. Of course, it could need servicing or whatever, but like that's a whole different thing than fabbing. So that's one thing. So buying a secondhand car, keep that in mind, that the cars that are like 100% done, like that are perfect, that don't need any work, they're always going to bring more money. If you're a fabricator yourself, and if you have like time, because it's also of course a time scale, of these pro guys don't have any time. If you're like, hey, it's winter in Sweden, I've got lots of time to build a car, you could buy a car that needs a little bit of work, because you're going to be on the other end of the spectrum. You're going to be paying a relatively lower price, like a bigger difference than what the work needs compared to a car that doesn't need any work. So you can definitely do good deals there. What I always think is a very important thing to think about, like there's a couple things you really want to be very strict about. So one of them, of course, is the rules. If you want to compete with a car somewhere, make sure that it complies to the rules, and especially the big things. So firewall modifications, location of engines and all kinds of things, and also where the coolers and stuff are situated, because in some series you can't run the coolers outside of frame rails, so your coolers can be under the headlight, for instance. It needs to be in the center of the car, and that stuff can be expensive to change, because it can even end up with the car needing a remap, because if you're running an intercooler and all of a sudden you need to put the power steering cooler and the oil cooler and all that stuff in front of the intercooler, you could have way higher intake temperatures and the car would need a remap, just because the rules dictate that all the coolers with oil need to be inside the frame rails. So keep that in mind. Another thing also, of course, again, like most problems that we see with cars, dramas and cars not making to the start line, is electric. That's as simple as that, because a lot of people do really weird wiring. So make sure that the wiring is good, and if the wiring is junk, rip it all out and do completely new wiring. You can already tell from the type of connectors, if it's all like cheap connectors and it all looks messy and shitty and it doesn't look uniform and the routing of the cables is really weird, then it's probably going to cause you a lot of problems. So I would say that that's the main pitfall. If I look at secondhand cars for other people, there's like the most times that I'll advise against buying a car is when it has a really shitty wiring. Motors, I can't look inside a motor. People sell a car, it has a dyno sheet, it has specs, and everything is of course done by the best mechanic, and like, this is the best shop in my country, and they also build drag racing cars with 6,000 horsepower. Nobody says my motor's built by just an average motor builder. It's just a normal guy. Never heard that. Everybody's always with the best motor builder, so it's really funny that everybody's the best builder. Anyways, doesn't matter. So like, I can't look inside an engine, but like I can definitely look inside a wiring loom, and that's like when people are not very handy with it and when they don't have like a really professional crew, I'm like, yeah, you need to have a really bulletproof, idiot-proof wiring harness. So keep that in mind. Another thing that's important, of course, is to keep in mind what you're going to do with the car and where you're going to be running it. For instance, in Western Europe, it's very difficult to get ethanol. So if you buy an ethanol-based car and you need to remap it, it usually means a lot of extra work. We've just finished the M62 B44 E46 with the supercharger, which the client actually called me before the client bought that car, and the client said like, hey, I want to buy this ethanol car. What do you think? And I'm like, yeah, well, it sounds good. Like, it's nice. It's not really the engine that I would immediately choose. But on the other hand, if it's a good deal, it's a pretty cool engine. But it needs to be rear mount radiator, because you're going to have a lot more heat if you remap a car from ethanol to pump fuel. So I always say that ethanol is a band-aid, so people can run like totally wrong compression, totally wrong cooling system. Like, the whole concept can be completely wrong, and it can still work because of the ethanol. Like I said many times before, it also has a lot of drawbacks. It's labor intensive. You can't just start the car all the time, cold start, drive it around a little bit, cold start, drive it around a little bit, drive it off the trailer, drive it to tech, drive it to the tent. Like, you're going to have like a quart of ethanol in the oil because of that. And like injectors, fuel pressure regulators, lines, tanks, everything kind of suffers from the ethanol. So keep that in mind if you're buying an ethanol car, that unless you drive it as a daily driver, it's a little labor intensive. Like, if you do events with it and you just park it in a corner after an event, you don't do anything with it, leave the fuel in there and all that stuff, you're going to get problems. So that's one thing. Make sure that where you're going to be using that car, that you're able to get the fuel that it's made for. Otherwise, you need to remap it. And if you remap from 93 octane to 91 octane, it's going to be fine. But if you remap from ethanol to petrol, you can run into all kinds of problems, like injector sizing. Intake temperatures could be really high, oil temperatures could be really high, coolant temperatures could be really high. So keep that in mind when you're buying a car with ethanol, that you reserve some budget. And it can be a lot of money. Like, if you have to move the radiator to the rear and do all kinds of things, that's not cheap. Yeah, so keep that in mind as well. What fuel type, what fuel does the thing run? And do you need to change that later? And all kinds of little pitfalls that are on the way over there. Another really important point for me is how easy is the car to work on. So we see a lot of cars that are semi-shop built or like amateur shop built, so like shops that don't really build race cars, but they just happen to do some fab work. And again, like a lot of the concept of it is wrong. It's very difficult to work on. So we've had cars where the differential needs to come out in order to remove the main shaft, all these kinds of things. We had a car in the shop where all the wiring was tucked up high under the dash, and the dash was like 25 minutes to take the dash out because they put the dash in the car with the windscreen out. So they had all kinds of screws like all along the top of the dash, and like all the wiring was tucked up right under the dash. So if you had to troubleshoot something, or even check like I always like checking like the positive terminal connections, so nothing of that stuff vibrates loose, especially if you build everything. I don't like putting all the wiring on top of the tunnel, because it's always like kind of nice for people, like, oh wow, there's a nice tunnel right here, my switch panel is going on the tunnel, so all the wiring, all the relays, all the stuff goes on top of the tunnel. I don't like that. Why? Because there's always a lot of vibration in the car if you solid mount it to steel. So I always like to make like an aluminum bracket that's like suspended, and doesn't have to be suspended in rubber, but if you have like a nice aluminum panel that's held on by 2 or 3 M6 bolts, it can have a little bit of flex, a little bit of moving, so it's better than all the vibration. And another thing is that there's a fuck ton of heat coming from tunnels. And why? Because one, you have the transmission is going to be really warm. It's going to be 280, 300 degrees if you're doing a full comp day. Most of the cars have the exhaust running there. It's also going to be bringing a lot of heat in the tunnel, and it usually has nowhere to go. So that whole heat thing builds up in the tunnel, and you're going to have all your relays, all your switches, all this stuff on top of that. So that's how they're going to fail as well. You don't really want that. I've never seen anybody bring any spare wiring harnesses or anything on the grassroots level. Nobody even has wiring tools or cables or whatever. Like, we always bring extra wiring and extra relays and all that stuff with us. But like, that's like the real showstopper. And like I said, it's usually the last thing. So people take a car to paint, and then they get the car back from paint, like, oh, what's next? Oh, the wiring harness. Oh, damn. I don't want to drill a hole here, but there's like a really nice original bracket over here. Let's use that bracket. That's not how you do it. Like, before the car goes to paint, we put all the wiring, everything, even all the fuel lines, oil lines, brake lines, we all make that before the car goes to paint, because I want to make a decision. If there's an original bracket over here that looks great, but I actually want it to be there, then we drill out that original bracket and we put it over there. And there's a lot of guys that are like, oh, that's a nice convenient bracket. Damn, we're in a time crunch for this fuel lines. Let's just put it there, and that's not how you build cars. Like, there's only one good spot for most things. And if the original spot is 1 inch wrong, then it's 1 inch wrong. And don't use it. And don't like, oh yeah, it's nice and convenient, it's already been painted, I don't want to drill a hole or whatever. That's just the wrong concept. So that's how you end up with cars that are difficult to work on. And also keep in mind, like, what's the order of building things? So in what order are you putting stuff on? Like, there's guys that really don't think about that. So they'll put oil lines on a car, or like oil cooler lines on a car, and then they on the motor, and then they put the motor in the car, and you can never reach the oil lines again. Like, it sucks. Even if the little bolt that holds them in or something will work itself loose, you can even check it. You can't even like torque it to spec. So keep that in mind. If you buy a secondhand car, that's also one really big drawback that I see all the time. That it's just like, it's so hard to work on those cars. Like, seats is the #1 thing. The way people put seats in cars, I don't even understand how some of it even makes it there. Like, I'm like, did somebody make their own tool to put this bolt somewhere there and all that stuff? And it kind of sucks, because if you buy a car, you can definitely have the need to swap seats, or to put the seat in a different position, higher, lower, whatever. So then you find out, like, oh my god, we've got people bringing cars like, it's totally done, it's 100% done, it just needs the seat adjusted. And then I put the thing on the lift, and I'm like, well, it's done, but it's done in a different way. It's like, basically needs a full rebuild, but all right. But if we have to change that seat, sometimes like they put through bolts on with like the nut on the under the car, so you need to have like a spanner under the car and like be some kind of monkey, or be with 2 mechanics and get to that bolt, and it's all like shitty and rusted, and like sometimes it took a hit from running over something, so the bolt is bent and all this stuff, and it's definitely not structural just to put it through the floor and stuff. So keep that in mind. Like, most people build cars that are very difficult to work on. So you can have a good deal on that car, but it could definitely be a nightmare to work on a track. Yeah, keep those things in mind, like the fuel. Is it easy to work on? How is the electronics and electrics? Like, can somebody explain you exactly how the electrics work in that car? Because it could definitely be a nightmare to find it out on a track. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know if there's any questions.